think that's the single biggest virtue of this agreement, is that it ends, at least for now, hopefully indefinitely, the risk of a downward spiral into a full-blown trade war with our nearest neighbors and biggest trading partners. Unfortunately, I think if you look at the specific changes to the agreement, they're small and mostly negative. You know, putting a sunset provision is a bad idea, if you ask me. Going with country-specific rules of origin defeats the purpose of a continent-wide free trade zone.
Oh, I thought the rules of origin were supposed to prevent it from allowing in China and other nations that were kind of sneaking through.
No, they're really designed to require a certain minimum, to put a quota on Mexican cars is what it is. And in fact, there are explicit quotas.
But when we've heard from Wilbur Ross and others, their point with that was that China was sneaking a lot of components into Mexico and thereby getting around.
Yeah, I don't think that's what this is all about. I think there is an explicit intention to limit Mexico's competitive advantage, which is low-cost labor. And so, as I say, there are rules that will require a certain amount of components to be made in high-wage countries, and there are limits, even if you comply with that, quotas. We didn't get rid of the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, which I thought was going to sort of automatically go away with an agreement. Now, having said all that,
the sunset's not as bad as it could have been, though, because this is
much
rolling.
Much of this is in the category of not as bad as it might have been, and not as bad as we thought it would be. The rolling 6 years that, in theory, gets added to the end of a 16-year agreement, it's pretty much theory. Remember, all three countries have to unanimously agree at that moment that they're going to tack on that period of time. I think that creates a dangerous dynamic of brinksmanship and negotiating for who knows what. Having said all that, this requires implementing legislation in Congress. Mm-hmm. And that's an opportunity for us to take a look and to perhaps tweak this in ways that don't require reopening the negotiations, but might take some of the rough edges off. And there are some good things, by the way, right? Better intellectual property protections, longer protection for biologics, a little tiny bit of additional access to the Canadian dairy market. So there are some good things as well, but on balance, you know, better than it might have been.
Let's talk about China, because the president did reference that last night in that 16 Minutes interview. I think he said that he had called it a battle in the past, but he would really call it a skirmish at this point. What would you call it?
Well, it's a pretty significant skirmish if it's just a skirmish. You know, it's very broad now. The threat for much more. Here, one of the things I'm a little concerned about is sometimes I think in Washington, a lot of folks conflate discrete ideas that are not really sort of well thought through. So, for instance, we have, I think it's pretty clear, pretty systematic theft of intellectual property, right? It comes in various ways, but it happens. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be certainly
by forced transfer of technology.
Exactly, right. So different mechanisms by which American IP gets taken. I think that's hugely problematic. That's theft, right? Then we have, the president talks about the trade deficit per se, and characterizes it in a way that makes it sound almost like it's theft, when in fact, I don't think that's the case at all. And then you have the geopolitics of a sort of assertive China, especially in Southeast Asia. I'm not convinced that we have a holistic approach here.
Although Stephen Mnuchin was on Squawk Box on Friday, and he said the two issues that have to be part of this would be the forced transfer of technology and the forced joint ventures. Every time an American company goes,
I totally agree. Here's the thing, as you and I both know, if we got a complete agreement from the Chinese that those practices were going to come to an end tomorrow, we would still have a big trade deficit with China. And so it's, at some point we've got to be clear, what is it that we're insisting on here?
So you'd be on board for some of the egregious issues that we just talked about. You want to see a hard line pushed in that situation?
Absolutely, yeah. On the theft of intellectual property, coercive technology transfer, forcing joint ventures that share information, all of those things I think are absolutely outside the norm and demand an aggressive response. But the fact that my constituents can buy affordable T-shirts that are made in Chinese factories, that does not strike me as nearly the same magnitude.
You are concerned, though. You're working with Lighthizer right now to try and get exemptions for many of your constituents.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How many companies are you?
Oh, my goodness, many dozens. You know, we have been buried with requests from Pennsylvania companies that use products that are either subject to the tariffs or they're subject to some kind of retaliation. But specifically, there are a lot of companies that buy you know, a particular widget that you just can't get anywhere else to their specs in a timely fashion, because this is the supply chain that they have developed. So it's really problematic for a lot of Pennsylvania companies.